Hello, I'd like to welcome comrades and friends to this week's online communist forum, as usual, hosted by the Weekly Worker and Communist Party of Great Britain. Tonight, the forum is hosting a debate on communism and trans liberation. We have two speakers, Mike Macnair from the Communist Party of Great Britain and Gabriel from the Spartacist League in Britain. There will be plenty of time, as usual, for debate at the end of the session. And I believe, Mike, you are going to go first.
Okay, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Gabriel, for coming to this. I hope that this will be productive discussion. I, I'm speaking myself to draft theses which I produced for CPGB discussion and to various writing which I've done um, in the pages of the Weekly Worker, but I can't say this is CPGB position because we haven't, although the draft theses were commissioned by the PCC, we haven't actually adopted them, and the organisation hasn't actually voted on them. They're up for amendment. Um, Second point, I'm going to speak about what I think are differences, what I think is common ground between us, and what I think are differences. And I think there's a lot of theoretical and historical differences, but I'm not going to talk about those, well, unless I have time to some extent to talk about those, between that I have a lot of theoretical and historical differences with the um, women and the article Transgender Liberation, Liberal Betrayal, Marxist Answers in Women and Revolution. And I'm sure that Comrade Gabriel will have a lot of similarly theoretical and historical differences with the stuff that I've written. But I think that on the other hand, there's a lot of common ground in terms of operational politics between the two positions, and some significant and important differences of operational politics between the two positions. So that's what I'm going to focus on, the common ground and the differences. Now, working through the matters which I understand to be common ground, first, it's a responsibility of communists to fight the current witch hunt against trans people. And that implies, in the first place, clear rejection of the policy of tailing this witch hunt, which has been adopted by the Morning Stars Communist Party of Britain, who endorse the UK Supreme Court's Christianist definition of man and woman, um, and equally the weird, well, not weird, but the very similar position adopted by Lindsay German and the elaborate philosophical fantasies to back up German's position adopted by her partner John Rees in the Counterfire organisation. In my view, the primary means of fighting this witch hunt is exposing its fraudulent character, its dishonesty. But I put that as a separate point, slightly separate point. Secondly, we both, I think, understand. I think we both the article and my own position. We reject the view that the sort of progress is inevitable. Liberal the Spartacist comrades say liberal gradualism. I want to be a bit cautious about that because the liberals are not exactly gradualist, but the idea that there's a sort of inevitable march of progress, um, which is not just held by liberals but also by Fabians and was extraordinarily widely believed before 1914, though not among Marxists before 1914. Third, the dominant tendency among trans rights activists have allowed themselves to be led into an indefensible salient. This is a salient is a military metaphor where a group of soldiers advances into the midst of the enemy ranks in circumstances where they can be attacked on both flanks and as a result defeated. So an indefensible salient, we can think of a salient may um, be the means of breaking through, but it's more likely a salient is that it's pinched off and it ends in a defeat. Mhm. They've put themselves into this salient by allying themselves with the liberals and with the human resources departments, the what used to be called the personnel departments, um, around gender recognition as a formal gender recognition as a legal right, and around no platforming transphobes, which are the two things are totally interlinked because it's the claim that you can resolve the problem of discrimination against trans people by legal protection by the bourgeois state, which carries with it the logic that you have to know platform transphobes. Uh, Fourth point, um, we've got a move from dominance of liberalism, which was characteristic of the later 1980s and 1990s and into the early 2000s, into a now it's a little complicated. We CPGB we've characterized the period since 1991 as a period of reaction of a special type, um, which one in which it wasn't so much the case that Marxists were repressed as that Marxists were ridiculed. Communists were repressed as the communists were ridiculed. Um, but this period of that what we have now is a period of shift towards the ascendancy of patriarchal conservative politics at the expense of liberal globalization. Mhm. Um, and that, in a sense, looks more obviously like reaction. Fifth point, and sorry, this is animated, I think, common ground also. This is animated by the decline of the US led imperialist world order. Um, in the period of the ascendancy of the US led imperialist world order, in the initial period, there was, in fact, a system of reaction around family and household, women into the home, women out of the workforce, persecution of homosexuals in the Lavender Scare, which the comrades draw attention to, um, uh, uh, serious efforts to enforce Jim Crow in the South, which gave rise to the reaction against that, which was the civil rights movement. But in the 1960s through, then there's the ascendancy. The United States sells itself as the champion of liberalism and liberty, and the sponsor of modern art and individualism and creativity and individual rights and so on and so forth. But that's gone with the decline, the entry of the US imperialist world order into decline. That ability to sell itself as the producer of progress and liberty is gone. Fifth point: communists, our common aim is a society without classes, without the state, and without all forms of oppression, including forms of oppression around gender. Mm-hmm. In the draft theses, I've formulated it a little bit more positively than that, and in that sense, related to the arguments of the Marxist Unity Group in the United States and of Comrade Roxy Hall, that the communist future is one which we think of Promethean possibilities of human emancipation, and that the possibility of sex change is one among many, many, many possibilities of human development, which is opened up fully by communism. Sixth point, we reject the Spartacist comrades call it the liberal idealist theory. We reject, I would say, Foucaultian and Euro-communist conceptions, according to which the material is determined by the overdetermined by the ideological, that culture overdetermines biology and the cultural construction of science and so on and so forth. The reality is that line of argument, which Judith Butler is one of the most distinguished exponents of as far as the trans movement is concerned, carries with it as a logical necessity that if you believe that, and you have to believe in uh, marginal utility, subjective marginal utility economics, and it logically follows that unemployment is caused by the unreasonable refusal of workers to refuse to accept below subsistence level wages, or to refuse to work, as the guys were prosecuted in the 1730s for refusing to work more than 16 hours a day, to the great loss and damage of their employers. Um, Seventh point, in relation to society as it is, the character of society as it is, we're in terms of game theory, we're in a negative sum game. We will continue to be in a negative sum game until the United States empire meets the fate of the British Empire. The total amount of the size of the cake is getting smaller. The fact that the size of the cake is getting smaller inherently sets up conflicts between cis women and trans women as a particular example. There are other examples of one sort and another. Eighth point, and these are all points which my understanding is that we have common position in relation to what the comrades have written in their article and what I've written. Eighth point, sort of a pâté les bourgeois countercultural ways of living. The idea that the counterculture is in itself a tendency to overthrow the capitalist social order is misconceived. It was misconceived when GLF guys in New York and in fact in London in 1970-71 adopted the slogan, "Hey, hey, what do you say? Try it once, you might be gay." Um, and it was misconceived when Pat Califia and co-thinkers in the lesbian BDSM group SAMWA argued that BDSM is the most genuinely um, tending to undermine social hierarchy by showing the hard-on which lurks beneath the priest's robe and the army officer and the police officer's uniform. It's a misconceived conception. It doesn't lead to social emancipation. Ninth point, we reject the policy of no platforming turfs. It's self-defeating. I add, I'm not sure if this is something that the Spartacist comrades would also say, that the policy of no platforming turfs has actively promoted the policy of no platforming anti-Zionists. That it's given real serious ideological support to the efforts of the much more powerful efforts of the capitalist state and parties to no platform anti-Zionists. 10th point, our perspective is essentially that of a class movement and of the unification of the class movement against the common enemy, which is the capitalist class and its state. And therefore that our politics is directed towards seeking common ground rather than towards the idea of an intersectional coalition in which all of the parts are equal parts and which everybody has a veto. Every caucus has a veto in the intersectional coalition. in a sense that I've written this in a different way. That strategy is expressed quite well in Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners in 1984-85, where the guys organising collections for miners' support in the pubs and clubs did so on the basis of the common experience of oppression by the police between the guys in the clubs and the pickets, the guys on the picket line. And that's it's not the whole of the story, but it's a very large part of the story of how gay liberation, lesbian gay liberation, came out of the margins and became a mainstream political phenomenon. So only part of the story, because the other part of the story is U.S. Defense Department went for anti-discrimination after its near collapse of the army in Vietnam. Um, so second point. Uh, my second general part is operational political differences. Now, some of these may be just formulations, but they appear to me to be operational political differences. The first is the obvious point, and I'm sure it is genuine difference. The CPGB insists that we need a maximum program and a minimum program. I would say we need a maximum program because we need the aim which goes way beyond capitalism. It's not a question of, and in that sense, it's common with the comrades saying we're opposed to liberal gradualism, we're opposed to Fabianism, and so on. We have an aim of communism, which is a society without class, state, etc. We need the minimum program. Basically as the minimum conditions under which we would take responsibility for a government. And we need a minimum program because the working class as a class, in order to pose the question of overthrowing the state order, needs to take the political lead in the society as a whole. It needs to propose legislative reforms. It needs to propose constitutional change, etc. Even though we know in reality that in order to achieve that constitutional change, that we can achieve the individual reforms, in order to achieve the package of the minimum program, we actually need to overthrow the state power. Okay, so CPGB, transitional program, this is just me, is in my opinion, it was a mistake made at the fourth Congress of the Comintern. They were debating whether the minimum program was necessary or not. Nikolai Bukharin was arguing that it wasn't necessary. They fudged the difference by saying that you have to have transitional demands rather than saying you have to have minimum demands. And that fudge was made in a caucus meeting of the Bolshevik delegation to the Fourth Congress of Comintern, and then they curtailed and cut short the discussion. However, that's relatively secondary. Second and relating to that, however, the Communist Manifesto says we stand for the abolition of the family. Yeah. But in reality, that's about what happens in the transition to full communism. Under conditions of market society, and as a result of that, actually not just under conditions of market society, but under the dictatorship of the proletariat, it remains the case that we cannot live by market relations alone. We cannot live by market relations and the factory alone. In fact, if we think about the Stalinist regime, part of the paralysis of the working class under the Stalinist regime is that in order to get welfare, you depended on your employer, because the welfare systems were to a very large extent tied to your employer. So if you get sacked, you're in the shit. Mhm. Um, but under capitalism, the market does not provide everything that you cannot provide everything that people need. Suppose I get the flu and I have to go to bed for 3 or 4 days. The market is not going to supply me. I'm not going to be able to pay for somebody to come and help out with the shopping and stuff like that. Yeah. Um, Suppose that I had kids. Well, I have kids, but they're grown up. Suppose I had young kids, then the market is not going to provide, and the state only does limited provision. And then the consequence of that is that the working class input is more dependent on the family than the middle classes, because the middle classes can buy in more services from the market. And the consequence of that is that if you appear to be pushing the immediate abolition of the family, if you push in a way which appears to be pushing the immediate abolition of the family rather than the withering away of the family, that puts you in the same position as the guys in the exposed salient, that you're going to distance yourself from the actual working class. Result of this difference is that the program section of the Part 3 Marxist Program to Fight Reaction in the Transgender Liberation article is, in my opinion, rather more abstract and less concrete than the program sections of the material in the draft theses which I've drafted. So, second point, very early on in the um, transgender liberation article, we've got the statement that there's a counterposition made between liberal gradualist means on the one hand, and on the other hand, working class methods. Okay, this may well be a formulations question. My understanding of the problem, in essence, is that the difference between reform and revolution is not a matter of means; it's a matter of ends. And formulating it as a matter of means is like the Socialist Workers' Party imagining that, which is the line which the Socialist Workers' Party continually reasserts, and RS21 continually reasserts. The essence is to fight on the streets and by strike action. The essence of the difference is fight on the streets and by strike action, rather than a difference of ends. Third point is related to this. Again, point 6 in the Marxist program to fight reaction is the working class is the decisive force. And the formulation is contained, the formulation which is earlier in the text is the fight for sexual liberation is not only compatible with the fight to emancipate the working class, but also integral to the day-to-day struggle in present society, which is true. But the question is, why is it true? And in the point 6 at the end, we have the formulation only through fighting for the liberation of every oppressed group in society can unity be forged. But that's actually exactly the intersectionalists' formulation. And it doesn't really work like that because, again, look at the 1984 to 5 miners strike, look at the recent strike wave in Britain, look at strike waves elsewhere. Actually, when the working class as a class moves into action, it pulls in behind it. all the oppressed.
Mike, you've got 5 minutes left, okay?
5 minutes left, yeah. The reason why we need to fight reaction in these things is not that we cannot unify the working class if in the absence of fighting for the liberation of all of the oppressed. It's that capital pulls the working class or sections of the working class in behind it, either, which the comrades clearly understand, that the people have been pulled in behind liberalism, and then clinging to liberalism results in a whole section of the working class being pulled in behind reactionary Christianism and its offshoots, Farage and all that crap. So that the question of is not posed in the sense that the working class is disunited because it's split up. It can't strike. The RS21 guys argue this. We can't get the strikes organised because there's too much racism in the working class or too much sexism in the working class. Absolute bollocks. It's the problem is developing class independence from the politics of the capitalist class. Final point of difference, and this is just a general point of difference between CPGB and the International Communist League. We need the International Revolutionary Party, yes. Forward to a reforged Fourth International. The problem, we've got too fucking many. There's the Revolutionary Communist International. There's the International Socialist Tendency. There's the Committee for a Workers' International. There's the Committee for a Marxist International. There's the Mandalite USEC. There's the International Communist League. There's the International Bolshevik Tendency. There's the, Morenista organization run out of Argentina. There's Partido Obrero's International Front. We've got umpteen fucking international organizations. We've even actually there's a Maoist International, and there's much the biggest of them, I'm sorry to say, Official Communist International Coordination. The problem is not just we need an international, it's how to overcome the problem of having too bloody many internationals, and that I'm not persuaded that the comrades of the International Communist League have actually thought through how to deal with that. So that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you very much, Mike. Gabriel, would you like to go straight in?
Yes. Hello, comrades. I would like to start by thanking the CPGB for organizing this discussion. Just on the last point that Mike made, we of course also share the despair at the number of international communist organizations that exist, and we also actually work towards the regroupment of international communist forces. But I won't go too much into this today because that's a bit of another theme. So the trans question today is of central importance to the left. First, because it's being used by the right as a spearhead for reaction. Second, because it's a great source of disunity in the left. And third, and most importantly, because trans people represent one of the most oppressed groups in society, whose cause must be championed by communists. So in my report today, I'll try to outline the basic approach of the Spartacist League to the question of trans liberation. I think the discussion today should be quite interesting because, as Mike just mentioned, we do overlap on a lot of questions. So I'm hoping that the discussion today can really get to the essence of the matter. So for us, we view our task regarding the trans question in a consistent way as how we view our tasks in general. For us, Marxism is a guide to action. We must use its method and materialist rooting to guide the struggle of the oppressed. As for the CPGB, we think the strengths and weaknesses of its approach to the trans question reflects those it has in general. We think the CPGB is in rare company in the British left in that it upholds orthodox Marxist conceptions on many questions and will argue for them polemically within the left. However, we believe it does so from an overly abstract standpoint, which doesn't help in guiding the struggles at hand. I'll show this concretely in regards to the trans question more towards the end of my presentation. First, I want to try to explain the basics of our approach. So the first step to make a constructive intervention into the trans movement is to understand the political situation it finds itself in. It's not difficult to observe that the trans movement finds itself on the back foot and is isolated. Where Marxists have a unique contribution to make is in giving a historical materialist explanation for the current backlash. This is not just a theoretical exercise, but essential if we want to root our intervention in concrete material reality. To understand the debates over the trans question, it's necessary to take a broader view and place them within the general trends of historical development. Somewhat counterintuitively, although Mike also mentioned this, we need to start with the position of the US in the world to understand the challenges facing the trans movement. In the 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US, starting from a position of uncontested hegemonic power, has seen its relative position and that of its imperialist allies gradually decline. As all empires, its ideological and political superstructure evolved in tandem with these economic and geopolitical changes. So the ideology embodying the interest of the US order started with liberal triumphalism in the 1990s, basically that the American model was universally applicable and preordained to triumph. Then in the 2010s, you get a liberalism that started to be challenged. It becomes increasingly brittle and hysterical, aggressively confronting any kind of opposition. You can just think back at the crazy Russiagate campaign. And now today, we have an openly anti-liberal Trump regime. So the key thing to understand is that these ideological changes reflect changes in the material position of US imperialism. Now we have to see how this relates to the trans question. The thing that's important in terms to understand why the trans question is so explosive and holds so much weight in public debate is that it stands right at the frontier of two broad historical trends. It started to become a question in the political mainstream right as the liberals were increasingly running out of road. So you have typical neoliberal leaders that started to push for trans rights as a way to appear socially progressive at little cost. Comrade Macnair has written articles about how the Theresa May government tried and failed to do this. So it's certainly a good thing that being trans became a more socially acceptable thing. But the fact that this happened right as the liberal world order was plunging into an existential crisis has meant that the support for trans rights has been very brittle. It didn't take much for supposed champions of the trans cause to turn around and embrace totally reactionary anti-trans positions. You can look at the Labour Party for an example of that. The other consequence of the trans question breaking out on the political scene when it did is that much of the pro-trans discourse has been tainted by the worst traits of liberalism in crisis: extreme moralizing, brittleness, refusal to engage in debate. For a group which represents a tiny minority of the population, such methods are disastrous and can only further its social isolation. For Marxists, a central task is to make the junction between the trans movement and the workers' movement. Here too, it's essential to understand the broader context. Throughout the Western world, the working class has moved sharply against the liberal status quo, sick and tired of being told to accept worsening living conditions in the name of grand abstract ideals. The problem, however, is that this backlash against the status quo is taking on a conservative anti-liberal expression, which directly takes issue with minority rights, in particular those of trans people. So from all of this, we draw a rather simple conclusion. The trans movement's association with liberalism has been an albatross around its neck. The only way it can make an alliance with the working class if it breaks this connection and fights for trans rights on the basis of a class perspective. So I'll explain a little bit more later what we mean by this concretely. But before that, I want to explain a little more how we theorize the trans question. So as you know, debates on gender and sex tend to be very heated. For us, before delving into this question, it's important to situate the debate and understand what does each side try to argue. So at bottom, the anti-trans side seeks to make it more difficult to be socially accepted as trans. To justify this, they present reality as fixed and unchanging. This is why they harp on biological essentialism so much. The pro-trans side of the debate, for its part, wants to make being trans more socially acceptable. Unfortunately, they usually do so by using relativism and idealism, where categories are entirely arbitrary and depend solely on individual will. We see the most absurd version of this when a cis person claims they could change their gender by simply proclaiming themselves another gender. Of course, transitioning is a social process. So as Marxists, of course, we're on the pro side of the debate. But as in all other struggles, we root it in a dialectical materialist analysis, in which reality is not fixed, but contradictory and in constant change. If we want to not just change individuals, but society, this approach is essential. So how does this translate concretely in understanding gender and answering the notorious question, what is a woman? We start by recognizing that there is indeed a qualitative biological difference between male and female humans. Without this dichotomy, human reproduction would be impossible. This is not to deny that there is a spectrum, where a small number of individuals are not easy to place in these discrete categories, but these variations are within a essentially bipolar spectrum. While a lot of the heat comes from debates over biology, this is not really the heart of the matter. Chromosomes and the ability to reproduce are not actually decisive in determining social relations between the sexes. The real contention is about gender. In other words, the social significance of being a man or a woman. And the reason why reactionaries always refer to biology, as I already mentioned, is because they think it can easily prove the argument that there are fixed, impermeable categories between the genders. Against this, the trans movement is correct to argue that gender is first and foremost social. But just because something is social doesn't mean it's not real or that it can be changed at whim. In fact, trans people know better than anyone how difficult it is to transition from one gender to another. It is not a purely individual process, but a social one, in which for most it is a constant struggle to be accepted. But the most important mistake made by the mainstream trans movement is precisely to downplay the material roots of gender division. So the fact is that sexual division of society runs extremely deep and is rooted in the institution of the monogamous patriarchal family. This institution predates even capitalism itself, and it cannot simply wished away. Maybe there's a bit of confusion here because we don't think that the family can simply be abolished. And in fact, denying the centrality of the family is one of the central starting points of Judith Butler, which Mike also just mentioned before. But the truth is that the defense of the status quo is not dependent on backwards ideas that are floating around in people's head. They are rooted in the way society is organized. So even in countries like Britain, and again, I'm echoing some of Mike's points, there's the NHS, but the provision of social care is very much dependent still on family relations. The same is true for education, raising children. So there's no theoretical argument that can be made that can make such material dependences simply disappear. And that's really the root of conservative ideas on the family and on gender. It's this material relation. So we compare in many ways the question of gender to that of religion. As Marxists know, religious ideas are wrong. But we're not crusading atheists who seek to just purge ideas out of people's heads or by mocking religion. We understand that religion is rooted in a social need, that it's the opium of the people. As such, while arguing against religious illusions, we fundamentally seek to remove the social needs for such ideas. So our approach to gender has to be the same. We can't abolish gender. It must wither away. So of course, this doesn't mean that trans people need to wait until after the revolution. Rather, it means that the fight for trans rights here and now must consider the material constraints in which it takes place. It means understanding that in the same way the majority of the working class will not be won to atheism before the revolution, it will not be won over to the idea of ending all gender divisions either. But it is through its struggles that the working class can be won to the understanding that the organized church is its enemy and that fighting for trans rights is a necessity. In both cases, the masses do not start with the correct abstract conceptions. Ideas change as a result of struggle and change material conditions. Here, I'll just want to delve a little bit with what Mike said earlier in terms of the unity of the working class. We do think that this is really a fighting for the rights of trans people or fighting against racial oppression is not something that will just automatically happen as the class struggle is engaged, but it's something that really needs to be consciously brought in and fought for. And really, it is the question of the unity of the working class, because you can engage in a strike, but if racial divisions still exist, it will undermine the unity of the working class in action. The basis for unity, whether it's on the national question, racial oppression, has to always be the defense of the oppressed. That's the only way you can build real, lasting unity. Okay, so now that I've kind of explained our basic approach, at least in a brief way, I would like to go a bit to some concrete questions where I think the differences between our approach and the CPGB comes out a bit more. So I'll start with our interventions in your party. So as you know, the trans question is extremely polarizing in your party and has already basically threatened to tear the party apart. For us, it's really essential to weigh in on these disputes and put forward a position which can unify the working class and the trans movement. So as you know, the controversies in your party kicked off when Adnan Hussein, one of the independent Muslim MPs, said he defended women-only spaces. So this sparked a strong reaction among pro-trans activists. And while it was necessary to argue against Hussein's views, it was necessary to do so in a way which wouldn't push away the left-leaning Muslim activists, which of course is exactly what Sultana did when she said that there's no room in your party for socially conservative views. So the problem with what Sultana's approach is, once again, focusing on what ideas people have in their heads, rather on how to unite them in a common struggle. So in our intervention on the question, we argued that an alliance between Muslims and trans people can be built if we insist on the need to fight for each other's rights. So of course, this includes the right for trans people to have access to public space that is corresponding to their gender. So such an alliance, though, doesn't need to, as a precondition to accept gender theory or Islam for that matter. But to build such an alliance, it's necessary to push back against both sides, the conservative prejudices of certain Muslims and the moralism of certain trans activists. In both cases, the key argument to make is that neither group can afford to be isolated. They need to forge an alliance, and that this can only be done by uniting into a common struggle where it is accepted that there are different views on social questions, but where each other's side will be respect and the defense of the other's democratic rights. So you see again here, it's not enough to just talk about class unity and struggle. You actually have to defend each other's rights. Otherwise, there's no basis for real unity. So I bring this whole question up because it very concretely brings to life all the theoretical questions on the trans question. The point of our theory has to be to overcome such immediate political problems. So I'm curious to hear what the comments of the CPGB thought of our intervention on this question. I thought that some of the points in Jack Conrad's article, Neither Kings Nor Empress, had some similarities to our views, but I thought it was, stayed rather general. So what's really our difference here? I think it's really how we view our respective roles in regard to your party. So for us, the main problem in your party is that it can't answer any of the important political questions of the day, centrally the divide between the left and the working class. At bottom, we think that Marxists are the only one who can provide real answers to this problem. In this sense, we think it's of the utmost importance that communists help overcome the tensions on the trans question in a progressive way. This is exactly the kind of question which divides the left and which is used as a wedge to drive workers to the right. This is why we have made intervening on the trans question one of the spearheads of our intervention in your party. For its part, the CPGB doesn't seem to recognize that there's a great divide between the working class and the left. At least it doesn't insist on this. And to the extent it recognizes the tension on the trans question, it does not view overcoming these tensions as central to its intervention in your party. Well, it's written pages and pages on the democratic functioning and the intrigues at the top of your party. It has made only passing comments on the trans question. But here's the question. What's the point of theoretical Marxist discussions on the trans question if we don't seek to use Marxism to advance the movement when it's concretely posed and urgently needed? That's really the whole point. The next example I want to use is on the Cass Review. The publication of the Cass Review in 2024 represented a major sea change in the public opinion in Britain. It was used to ban the provision of hormone blockers to teenagers and was used as a justification for the Labour Party to ditch any association with the trans cause. We think it was essential to oppose this ban and oppose the hysterical campaign around the Cass Review. So the problem we saw with most of the left's response to the review is that it didn't oppose the moralistic premise that youth should not be given a choice to decide their gender. In this regard, I think Comrade Macnair made an important mistake in his exchange with Comrade Brun, where he compared access to hormones and puberty blockers to the overprescription of antibiotics. While the latter concerns a medical condition, the former is a question of how an individual wishes to be recognized socially. Being trans is not a medical condition. Moreover, hormone blockers are generally safe and simply delay the onset of puberty. As communists, we don't think it's for the parents or the state to decide if a kid can be trans or not. As such, we are against restrictions on puberty blockers, and we hope the CPGB will review its approach to this question. Or I understand that this is not yet the official position, but I would urge comrades to consider these points. So I'll finish on going to a point that Comrade Mike also mentioned, which is the minimum and maximum program, because I do think that this is where really our fundamental differences is. So for us, the problem is not per se to have a minimum and maximum program. That's not per se the problem. But the problem is, what is this is to have a program that is viewed as a timeless set of positions that do not address how the questions are being posed concretely. So if I just give one example, like in the past 4 years, there have been undeniable qualitative changes to the world situation. Yet the CPGB's draft program has not significantly changed as a result. So if we look at the trans question, the movement is a very different place today than it was 5 years ago. So a program on the trans question, in other words, how we view a program is really the question of what should we be fighting for? It has to change to account for these realities. So we can debate over which 5 or 10 points a workers' government could enact to improve the condition of trans people, but that doesn't help in any way to guide people's struggles today. For us, the main problem facing the trans movement right now is its social isolation and its separation from the working class. In fact, that's basically the same program that the left has in general. And so for us, the main task is to try to overcome this state of affairs. If we work on the theoretical side of the question, it's to accomplish this objective. As for the maximum program, what a communist or socialist society will do, it's interesting and thought-provoking, and I certainly agree that this is an important aim that we must have that guides our work. But again, it's not getting us closer to how to get to socialism or even to a workers' government. So I think I actually am finishing a bit early. I just want to conclude on saying that I look forward to comrades' comments and criticisms, and that as two of the rare socialist organizations actually willing to engage with other groups, I hope the discussion today can be constructive and clarifying and lead to further debates down the road.
Thank you, Gabriel. That was very interesting, very thought-provoking. Comrades, as is usual, we'll take questions and discussions from the floor. There's quite a lot of comrades here tonight. I see there's 70 people in this meeting. And although Gabriel and Mike will sum up at the end, if there are other questions and discussions, I'll ask them to come in earlier than that. So let's start off with Stan then, please. Off you go.
Yeah, hello. I'm glad to see you there, Gabriel. Nice to have a debate like this. I was trying to take up a single point that Mike said. I think Mike said that in the Communist Manifesto, communists they will abolish the family, and I don't think that's right. I'm going from memory, but my understanding is that the family, whatever it will be in the future, is up to them, but it won't be governed by property. So we'll take away the unwanted part, but we're still people and we've still got family. And there's been all sorts of forms of family in history, haven't there? According to Engels' list, he's shown how it came about, the origin of the family. But I don't think communism means abolishing it. I think it means it will be done freely. It's personal relationships instead of being governed or overridden by property relations. That's it. Thanks.
Right, that was brief. Thank you, Stan. Anne?
Yeah, thanks. So, okay, so I think it is, of course, an extremely interesting and important debate. And I don't have any huge problems with either of what the two speakers have said. One thing I want to stress, and this is partly in response to some of the comments in the chat, is that sexual liberation has to be part of the revolution. And we have seen with every single revolution, well, I would say every single revolution, like progressive revolution that has come in to being, how that reflects itself in the oppressed sections, particularly women, throwing off the chains and acting in a way that they hadn't previously. So that question needs to be at the core of our program and our work as communists, the recognition and the active engagement with oppressed sections in order that the working class can really act as a tribune of the oppressed and that all sections of society can come together within the party and around the party. So I think that's really important. I mean, there was a comment made by Frank in the chat about it's not a priority. Well, that was exactly the problem that was faced by women after the Russian Revolution, when the tide started to go out, that defense of the Russian Revolution necessitated that question being put on the back burner. And it has happened so many times for women that they've been told, when we have the means to provide you with the things you need to lead a free life, or an equal life, then of course that's fine. That's not to say that I think that everything is possible now, not at all. But I think that the struggle to win those rights under the present society is axiomatic for communists if they want to really call themselves communists. And I think it's a great shame that in practical terms, the experience of women, and it seems in Britain, transgender people, has been a negative one when it comes to the left, because you gravitate towards an organization, yes, because of your views on the world as a whole, but also because of your experience. I don't think we can separate the two. And that when they come in, then that they find that there isn't really a place for them in that organization, or at least that the place in that organization replicates in large part their experiences of negative attitudes towards them in wider society. So I think that that is a question we have to deal with. I mean, you may accuse me of wanting to kind of create some sort of bubble, but I'm not. I'm saying we have to change ourselves. And so just finally on the trans question, like I'm not so well acquainted with the situation in Britain because I live in Ireland, and Ireland is not some Shangri-La by any sense of the imagination. But it is interesting how it is actually more open on the trans question than it seems to be in Britain. And certainly on the left, lots of young people on the left, are trans or non-binary or experimenting in different ways with their sexuality. And I, like, again, that's why I make that connection with your own self-liberation, sexual liberation, and the movement itself. Again, it's not to say that we should like turn it around and make it so that it's only about those questions, but I think that it would make it a much more interesting and a much more relevant movement when people feel that their own liberation is connected with that movement. So just I want to agree with Gabriel on the blockers. I think that like they shouldn't be banned, that the decision should be made in consultation with the doctor, the child's parents, of course, and it needs to be a careful one. But it's fair to say, I believe, from medical knowledge, research, that the sooner, if a person genuinely wants to transition, that the earlier they do it, the better. Because, well, I'm not sure of the medical reasons, but people I've known that have transitioned when they were young certainly found it a lot easier. And I suppose it has to do with the body, hormones and development of sexual organs and all the rest of it. But anyway, so I think I've made my points. Thanks, both of you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Anne. There's no more other comments. Yes, there are. Tina.
Yeah, also John Ryan had his hand up, but I can go first. So I think it's a really important discussion, actually, and it is a shame that the left doesn't do it. I mean, this is putting this out. I'm getting prepared for people posting all sorts of shite about how this is not you're debating my right to exist, etc., which is really unhelpful. So there's I quite agree with Gabriel, and I think Mike said it as well. This is going to be one of the key issues that's going to tear the Your Party apart. It's already started, sort of with the Sarah Sultana comment, who I understand had a lot of criticism from her allies about it when she said, I mean, she says this one thing which she repeats mostly is the trans rights are human rights. Well, okay, there she gets loads of applause for that, which I think is, I mean, we can support that, can't we? There's nothing wrong with saying trans rights are human rights, and we defend trans people. It was her comment, I think, when she said there shouldn't be a place for anti-trans in Your Party. I mean, it all depends what you mean by it, isn't it? It's sort of, we're revisiting, I think, the anti-Semitism smear campaign a little bit. So you basically say anything, you want to question something, and that makes you an anti-trans person, makes you a transphobe. I mean, we've had it in Sheffield, Your Party. It's repeated all over the place in other branches as well. As if you I've opposed a transphobe being excluded from the WhatsApp group because I don't think that's the way to deal with differences. Now I'm a transphobe because I've aided the transphobe.